Now that you've been on Rogan, there's a very good chance that you're gonna, I don't know, get a movie deal, or you're gonna write a book like 15 Rules for Dweebs or something, and you'll be the biggest thing since sliced bread. Barry Weiss is gonna adopt you as a child. Who knows what will happen next?
So, that'd be an interesting twist.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Ben Burgis, he's a big shot. He's back on the show. You wrote books for Zero Books, Give Them an Argument, Christopher Hitchens is God, and what was the other one? Oh, I hate all leftists. You're all too woke. That was the other title.
Yeah, those are the 3 books.
Yeah. And you decided to betray us all by going on the fascist Joe Rogan's podcast.
That's correct.
No, I watched some of that. It was good. It was a pretty typical Joe Rogan podcast. He gave you some booze at the start. How was it? Did you have a nice time?
Oh yeah, no, I had a great time. I mean, whatever. I got to spend 3 hours drinking bourbon with the news radio guy and talking about socialism. Why wouldn't I like that?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, but what I
should say too that those 3 books that you mentioned, the Christopher Hitchens is God, I Hate the Left, and Give Them an Argument. I guess that one doesn't have a new name.
Right. I was the most involved with that one, so that one gets to keep its name.
I should say we should probably explain to the viewers that even though Doug has his own publishing enterprise now, since he was involved at the time all 3 of those books came out, part of the royalties still go to him. So
yeah, absolutely. You should buy all of his books, multiple copies, send them to your friends. I'm very excited. Why didn't you bring a copy of your book to hold up when you were at the Joe Rogan Experience? He asked you, do you have a copy with you? And you held up Adolf Reed's book. Did Adolf slip you some money before you went on?
To be honest, I had left my hotel room and gone to find a breakfast burrito in Austin before I went to the studio, and I just had that book with me because I was reading it. And then I ended up getting the car to take me to the studio was already there by the time I got back. So that's just what I had on me,
So you didn't have time.
Although I will say I actually don't, since I am a huge Adolf Reed fan. It was not planned at all, but I'm not unhappy that I got to tell, however many people, listen to Joe Rogan, about him.
Well, I thought that you did a fine job on Joe's podcast. I don't think you convinced him that the socialists, like the Democratic Socialists of America, aren't really a bunch of nerds and wankers.
It's tricky because speaking as a DSA member, I am not going to die on the hill of denying that there are nerds and wankers in the mix. That's certainly true. I mean, what I would say is that I think that it's the you kind of have to go to war with the army that you have, and that there are a lot of people who are not nerds or wankers in DSA, and that they're there, and if there are more, right, that can only be good. And if somebody else starts a alternative organization that gets even bigger and pursues the sorts of things I find valuable about it, then great. I mean, organizations are just tools, but I did take the opportunity, because I saw I'd gotten 1,600 new Twitter followers since I went on to do a little post saying I would encourage people. I had 3 things, and one of them was it's imperfect, but I would still encourage people to join DSA. The other one was
By my book?
Yeah. Well, I already kind of talked about that in Joe, and that was the pinned tweets. The other ones were like subscribe to Jacobin and like start a union at your workplace. But just
could have mentioned sublation. You could have done that. No, this is good. So you were actually on two. I mean, you've been on a bunch of podcasts, I'm sure, but from my perspective, you've been on two important podcasts recently: the Joe Rogan Experience and the Bob Wright Show.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the Bob Wright Show is much smaller, probably. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun talking to him. I like that guy.
Yeah. And I thought of the two podcasters, Bob Wright gave you a lot rougher time than Joe did.
That's not exactly not in character for either of those guys.
Right. But I want to talk a little bit about that. Talk about your Christopher Hitchens book.
Yeah.
Because look, Bob Wright is a curmudgeon now. I don't think he's always been a curmudgeon, but he's gotten to the age where he can be that. And I've watched the Bob Wright and Mickey Kaus weekly. And I know a few things about him. One is that he's very strong in his opinions. And the second is that he doesn't like Bob Dylan. Like he thinks Bob Dylan is overrated.
Yeah, well, if that had come up, it would have been a much more contentious conversation. Like, as it was, we were just talking about Christopher Hitchens, who I have famously mixed feelings about. I mean, that's a lot of why I wrote the book.
Yeah, but I think that not liking Christopher Hitchens, like downplaying the significance of Christopher Hitchens to the degree that he did.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a
kind of par with saying that Bob Dylan.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So,
which doesn't mean he's wrong.
Sure,
it could be that Bob Dylan's overrated, right? It could be that Christopher Hitchens.
Sure. Yeah, but these are both pretty hot takes.
Yeah, those are hot takes. Yeah. So, but just for people who didn't watch the Bob Wright podcast, the claim that he made was that Hitchens, in a debate specifically with Bob Wright, used such specious logic, such a terrible argument, was such a sophist. That he exposed himself to not be a serious public intellectual.
Yeah, I mean, look, I watched that debate. I actually did a review of it on my YouTube channel, which is, I think, how Wright sort of thought to talk to me about this stuff. And I mean, I sort of think he's half right. I mean, I think that the idea that this is exposing that there's nothing there or whatever, I think that's wrong. I think that the part that's right though is that Hitchens definitely did bomb that particular debate. I mean, that's one of the worst debate performances I've ever seen from him since I think what it comes down to is he didn't research Bob's position the way that he should have, before talking to him. And my sense of what happened there is that this is a period of his life where Hitchens was doing 1,000 debates with religious people, and in most of them he was pretty good. But in this, I think it was weird. It was he almost kept forgetting what Bob's position was, and started saying things that would be an attack on the position that he clearly didn't hold, right? Which I don't think is I mean, I don't think I'm letting my, affection for my, complicated, problematic faith here, cloud my judgment. I think this is what I would say if it was anybody. I mean, if I was watching, whatever, William F. Buckley have a terrible debate or something, right? I just think that he wasn't really prepared, and that he didn't. I don't think it exposes deep intellectual bankruptcy. I think that he was just kind of thrown for a loop and he didn't know what to say.
Well, yeah, I just remember what Bob Wright said to you when you gave that answer, which was, but the argument we were having was central to the book. He wrote a whole book. It wasn't a tweet. It wasn't an essay.
No, I mean, it was
the argument, just to go over it for people who want it.
Yeah.
So the argument was basically that religion and religious people have done more harm to the world than good. And that overall religion is always, or as when measured, I don't know, in some hedonistic calculus, always does harm. And so But I think Bob asked him, gave some counter examples.
Yeah.
Like what about Martin Luther King, who was a religious man, and you could Stalin, who was an atheist. But the main one was just that there are examples of religious thinking and religious people who do great good in the world, right?
Yeah. Do you read the God Is Not Great?
I have not read the God Is Not Great. All I do nowadays is watch podcasts. So I haven't read that.
Okay, so I guess my take on this is that, it's like there are parts of that book that I like. There are parts of it I think are silly. I think one big problem with it is that the thesis is a little ambiguous, right? So because there's a strong way to read it, in which case, Bob is clearly 100% right? And I think there's a way to read it that's not so weak that it's uninteresting, but that would be that Bob's critique would be less relevant. But then if that's the way you read it, then Hitchens doesn't need to die in some of the hills that he's dying on in that debate, or for that matter, the book, right? So because in other words, I think a lot of what Hitchens said in this period, and a lot of, there's a whole chunk in my book where I'm criticizing his views about religion and, in the new atheist period. And, it's not 100% the same, but there's certainly considerable overlap, right, between the things that Bob has a problem with and the things that I do. I think that there are a lot of statements that Hitchens made that suggest that his thesis was that religion was a net negative, right? That it led to more harm than good, which that itself is really complicated and hard to adjudicate, right?
Right.
And but I think that's a not crazy thing to assert and defend, whereas it's a uniform good, right? There are no local contexts in which it's a good thing is just a silly claim, right? And part of the problem is that Hitchens often, his formulations about it often suggest that he's saying the first thing, but then he ends up defending just some nonsensical positions that he would only have to if he were arguing for this the second thing, that Martin Luther King, isn't really a good counterexample because we don't know what was going on in his head or whatever. It's okay, well, if we're going to play that game, right, there are no examples or counterexamples, right? We just have to disregard it all equally, and and the negative examples as much as the positive ones. And he also has on the Stalin side, I think he also, it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated than that, but it's definitely not fully satisfying. But also especially on the Stalin one, why is he bothering, right? Because even if you read him as saying religion is always negative, okay, fine.
That doesn't mean the other things aren't.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, he says many times that other things are also negative, right? So why is he taking on this argument that actually Stalin's crimes are partially the fault, or
of religion,
religion, when he could just say yeah, sure. Stalinism is bad. Christianity is bad. Lots of things could be bad, which would be the reasonable thing for him to do. I think that part of this might be a personality flaw, which is just that he was an incredibly stubborn person, and he just didn't. So I think sometimes he just didn't concede things that he should have conceded. Because he didn't need them for his argument, but he just didn't want to admit that people he was arguing with could have a good point. I think that's definitely a flaw in Hitchens' character. And it's even it even does relate to the bigger stuff that I talk about in the book, because I think that he probably would have given up on his leftist politics earlier than he did, if not for just kind of a sense of stubbornness, right? That he didn't want to let this sort of normies who thought it was weird that he would call himself a socialist win.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about Hitchens' Marxism that comes out of this. It's this was touched on in the conversation with Bob Wright as well. And it's funny that, Bob Wright, who's not a Marxist, kind of cottoned onto this, is that the whole new atheist movement, to me, seems to be I'll put it in platypoid kind of language, is a regression, right? from a Marxist perspective, which Hitchens was supposed to have. He called himself a Marxist, into, I don't know, a young Hegelian, like Feuerbachian perspective. You know, the if you've read the 11 Theses on Feuerbach, then you know why it's not necessary or helpful, not usually not helpful to critique religion as religion, to try to stamp out religious ideologies from people's heads. That in that document, Marx points out that the religious ideas are born out of the material conditions of the time, and that they, that basically the heavens is a mirror image of the earth. And that if you want to change people's religious conceptions, and then you need to remove and alter the material conditions that make those religious conceptions seem necessary or have a function.
Yeah, I mean, this is also what Marx pretty much says in On the Jewish Question and in the introduction of the Critique of the Philosophy of Right.
That, and in the German ideology, he goes on and on this topic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, so I think Marx's picture is, and there's part of this that I think Marx is wrong about, but I think there's part of it he's definitely right about, right? I think Marx's picture is one, like G.A. Cohen has a really helpful analogy for helping understand this, that he thinks that, Marx thinks this about a lot of kinds of ideology, but he definitely thinks about religion, that religious delusions, and I mean, he is still, despite all this, I mean, he is still like a super duper strident atheist, right? Religious delusions, as he would see them, are, he thinks are more like mirages than hallucinations, that like you don't stop, you see a mirage in the desert, like understanding intellectually that it's a mirage doesn't stop you from seeing it, so the analogy would be something like the sort of like psychological pull of religious belief, in a sort of broken world is not going to go away just because, because he even says, like, Introduction, Critique of the Philosophy of Right, all criticism starts with criticism of religion. He does seem to see some value in like intellectually criticizing religion, but he definitely thinks that like widespread religious belief isn't going to go away just because like intellectuals are criticizing religion. He thinks that you need to change the conditions that are creating this mirage. And I should say, by the way, the part of it that I find, even though there is a critique of Hitchens on religion very much along those lines that I give in the second chapter of the book, I think the part of all this actually that I'm least convinced by is the idea that in like even like the most, unimaginably advanced Doug Lane approved communist society that we could imagine, that religious belief would go away. I don't think it would. I think that like, I think that like the kinds of suffering that's caused by, economic and social, circumstances certainly contributes to it. But I also think that like, I mean, especially, and this is kind of hanging over the book a lot, that like I wrote it at this time in my life when like between Michael Brooks and stayed inside for a year because of COVID and other, bad things that, that happen to people that I care about in that time period. Like, this is probably the time in my life that I've like spent the most time since I was a little kid thinking about death, is like the last couple of years. And, it certainly hasn't turned me into a religious believer, but like it has made this sort of issue much more alive to me. And I tend to think that like, as long as people like know they're going to die, and that like there is going to be some psychological appeal to religious belief. And I actually kind of agree with Lillian Sekerchia, who told me that she thought that like it's possible that under socialism, because people have so much more free time and kind of resources to arrange their lives how they want to, that like not only will religion persist, it'll probably get way weirder.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by religion, right? Why is it that Marx says that all social critique begins with religious criticism of religion? It's not because he is against speculation about the origins of the universe, or that he is opposed to people who might be philosophically aligned with panpsychism or something like that, right? That say, oh, the whole universe is made of mind.
Which was kind of Engels' late view, I think.
Yeah, right. It's because he thinks that religious institutions and those kinds of beliefs shape the social relations of society, and that a belief in a god or an ultimate origin or some sort of metaphysical or theological system is used to justify hierarchical relations on earth. It's that role that religion plays in society, the way that it is used to justify our social organization, that pushes us to critique religion, because these are beliefs that at the very best are highly, highly speculative.
Yeah.
Right. It's not that they are, completely wrong. Right. I mean, in so much as neither is Thales completely wrong when he says everything's made of water.
Yeah, only about 10% wrong.
He's like, no, I think he's I don't know. I don't know what percentage of things are made of water.
But I have no idea.
But the point is, like, Thales isn't completely wrong to ask the question of what is it to exist? What is the common element or the substance of the universe really? And so that's a useful philosophical question, but his answer is wrong, right? So, like, I don't know. I think under communism, religion becomes philosophy, maybe, or something.
Yeah, I mean, to a point. I mean, I think that, like, you could, because I mean, I think it's not just that we find it interesting to speculate about metaphysics, but also I think, like, probably religion as, like, a sort of comprehensive set of, like, emotionally powerful symbols that are linked to the hope for another life after this one, that like gives you, might sort of help you make sense of the chaos of life, that, like, might be more powerful, precisely because it's in many cases, like, linked to longstanding tradition. Like, I just, again, in some sense, it might be unknowable. My suspicion, which doesn't make me particularly happy. Which, oddly enough, like, Hitchens has moments where he says stuff like this, and then it's like, okay, but then what are you doing, right? Like, that like, it just might, just like, the sources of that might be, like, deep enough in human psychology that we're going to get something that's, like, pretty close to religion as it currently exists, or at least, like, has a lot of the features that make religion not just speculative philosophy in any future society, right? I mean, it certainly wouldn't be the case that any religion that existed in the future would be, like, justifying capitalist property relations, but then again,
it wasn't in the past either,
right? Exactly.
That's not what Catholicism was originally, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I sometimes get confused about just what Christianity does today. Like I kind of have this vague notion of how Christianity functioned under feudalism, like, it's very simple narrative about what it was about. But like, today, what are these Christian churches about? What are they justifying? They're not justifying the kinds of social relations that you would hear described in the Bible.
No,
right?
No, certainly not.
Yeah, so it's weird. But I want to point out this. I want to ask you a different question, but we can go back to this.
Yeah.
The Denial of Death. Have you ever read Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death?
I haven't read that book, no.
Oh, okay, because he was a kind of Freudian, but he was a sociologist and literary critic, and he his book, The Denial of Death, which was published in the early 70s, and he died, like, shortly after it was published.
Yeah.
Ironically, was all about how life is an existential struggle, that most of our psychological troubles arise from our understanding of our mortality, and that even sociological ones arise from there as well. For instance, like conflicts between nations might be about how we're invested in cultural symbols or hero systems that give us a sense of immortality. And when we encounter people in cultures that have different hero systems, that comes into an existential crisis or existential conflict. And his solution for how to escape neurosis and psychosis as a human being that is doomed to die is become a Christian. Yeah, So I mean, I don't discount what you're saying, but I just think it's still worthwhile. I'm not completely on board with Becker either.
Sure.
And especially when it becomes a way to address social and political conflicts, because there's like a new school of Becker related psychiatry or psychology where what they do is it's called terror management therapy. So they're trying to manage people's existential dread so that they can be better liberal subjects and it's more accepting of other people, the more diverse cultures.
Which is tricky, right? Because okay, I certainly don't want that, but I mean, whatever. I want people to accept.
I like these guys. I mean,
sure,
they're worth talking to, but I don't think they're completely right. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I want people to, obviously, I want people to be liberal in that sense. They're accepting other cultures. I mean, I don't want them to accept the social conditions that they have around them. But then this is one thing that's tricky, and it's kind of funny because I think actually from the last few minutes of conversation, right? I mean, somebody might really guess wrong about my, my own views about some of this stuff, that because that might read me as a really sort of really benign hippie agnostic, which is not at all what I think, but I think that
I'm more like that than you are.
Yeah, no, you're for sure more like that than I am. Yeah,
yeah.
So I guess so on the one hand, but so even though the sort of religious solution to existential dread isn't one that I'm interested in, and and is one that a lot of ways I'm critical of. I guess one thing that the last couple of years has really sharpened for me is that the existential dread itself, I take more seriously, that I think that, okay, can religion and religious-like beliefs make people, too quietistic about unjust social conditions? For sure, right? They can. But that's not, they could also make you just come to terms with stuff that's just built into being a human being, and whether or not you like that way of doing it, right? Which again, in some ways I do not. I think that I think that it's a real mistake to just reduce it to the issue of the social conditions, right? That I was talking to Gregory Sadler is his name. I think he's a philosophy YouTube guy, and I interviewed him partially about Stoicism, and this is something I talked about there because you could make the same, a lot of the sort of open to the people who critiques you could make of religion, you could make there too, and I did sort of raise that, right, that this is something kind of teaching people to just sort of let go and accept what's going on around them, could be really bad from the perspective of trying to get a better society. But at the same time, I don't know that all that Stoic stuff is bad advice just for being a person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, ultimately being a Stoic on a day-to-day level, accepting the reality as it is on a day-to-day level, not expecting that you're going to be able to change anything overnight, and not feeling personal anguish all the time about the state of the world. That is, I think, all for the good. But just as a Stoic, it's still maybe the most Stoic thing you can do is try to calculate how to make things better and take the risk of an action that might change things without being emotionally or narcissistically invested in the outcome, but just
as you can imagine. I actually like that very much.
All right, you're back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that last thing you said very much, because I think it actually ties together some of the preoccupations of both of the last two books in an interesting way. But it does occur to me that it might be a good idea to like go back and say like 2 minutes about what I say about all this in the book.
Yeah. Okay. In the Hitchens book.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think that like I am in that second chapter of the book, I'm talking about a lot of, and kind of at the end of the first chapter, about the new atheist years and Hitchens' general analysis of religion and the sort of polemics and debates he get into about the relationship between religion and morality. And as you might imagine, given my views, I'm much tougher about his typical opponents in those debates than I am on him, right? Because I think they were like much more wrong than he was. But I do make this criticism in there that essentially, I mean, this is you kind of said this earlier with the young Hegelian thing, but like essentially the problem is, and the interesting contradiction in Hitchens's views is that, as you said, he said he was a Marxist, and not just in the sense of subscribing to the sort of normative political program that people typically associate with Marxism, but really specifically in the sense of like subscribing to Marxist theory of history. In fact, even after he abandoned the normative political program, he still made a point of saying that he accepted the theory of history. And in fact, like in his exchange, like post 9/11, exchange with Norman Finkelstein, he goes out of his way to defend historical materialism. He cites a book about historical materialism I know really well, which is the Cohen one I mentioned earlier. And in his last years, he'd sometimes say things like playfully, like, "I'm a very conservative Marxist," by which I take it he meant that he wasn't, he wasn't on board with socialism as an ongoing political program. I think there are reasons for that, or I think he might have been in a state of flux about some of his views about that. But one thing is clear that he didn't think was that was like on the table historically at this point, right? He thought it was over. But nevertheless, he thought that like as a sort of overarching view of human history, it was like the best way to understand that. And I'm sure that he was sincere about that, because I mean, who the fuck was he pandering to, right? By saying that, right? I mean, like nobody, right? Like that's the idea, that there's some audience of people who will be like, well, I disagree with him about Iraq, but like at least he agrees with historical materialism, like that.
That might exist today. It certainly didn't exist then. I don't think it really exists today.
No, I don't think it really exists today, and it damn for sure did not exist then, right? It's like I think he was like probably the single person in the world most sympathetic to that combination of views. So I think that So I think he was totally sincere about it, but I also think that there was this big contradiction within that, which is that, okay, so for decades, he had been, thinking about things this way, and he was still on some level intellectually convinced, but then a lot of the other things he said just didn't make sense given that. And I think, unfortunately, maybe if he'd had a lot more debates like the one he had with Bob Wright, like he would have had to grapple with this more, because the issue is about causation, and there is a way that I think technically you can reconcile some of what he says about this with what I'm about to say. I did a debate breakdown a couple weeks ago with Mark Warren and Ryan Lake of this debate that Hitchens and Stephen Fry were in with a Catholic archbishop and a Tory MP about whether the Catholic Church was a force for good in the world. And if you watch that, you can see like Mark and Ryan arguing that like I'm being too that there's like a more charitable read of some of this that I'm giving, but I'm going to go ahead and give the uncharitable one anyway. So I think that that the problem is this seems to just be like an idealist view of history, right? I mean, is it really that like religion is poisoning everything, or is it that certain, you know, economic and social structures are poisoning things, and that religion is certainly used as rationalization for that? But one of the points I make in the book is that if you accept anything like a historical materialist framework, you know, even a very like, you know, loose version of it where, you know, you accommodate, you know, like you're not dogmatic about it or whatever, like anything that would still recognizably be called materialism, you know, you're really emphasizing in your view of how history works the expansion of human productive forces and the ways that going along with that, the relations of production, you know, change over time, and, you know, and then the ways that in turn informs the kind of legal and political superstructure that you have. I think that, okay, imagine that the Emperor Constantine had never converted to Christianity, and so Christianity couldn't have been the justifying ideology of European feudalism. Well, whatever was, certainly wouldn't have been anything like the nice, liberal, pluralistic secularism that Christopher Hitchens liked, and, you know, whatever we like, you know.
And I think if you're Hegelian, actually, you would argue that without Christianity, that nice secular liberal ideology
would never come into being in the first place.
Yeah. That you know, the Hegel's philosophy sees a sort of unfolding of understanding, including Christianity and religion, and you know, there's some debate whether or not Hegel ever overcame his Christianity or not. You know, there's different interpretations of Hegel, but yeah, I think that from the historical materialist perspective, especially if you're teleological about it and think there's some sort of maybe looping, spiraling movement towards the absolute of self-understanding, you definitely have to see the stages that came before as necessary and as useful.
Yeah. So like, if that's right, then not only is this not materialist, it's not even Hegelian idealism. It's some other less interesting kind of idealism.
Right. Yeah.
No, I think there's definitely something there. So, and I think there is a link maybe between that and the contemporary political issue, which, you know, so there was a review of the book in Quillette by somebody who, you know, was extremely hostile, and I do think, like, you know, misunderstood a lot of the claims that were
Hitch and Stan, who thought you were too critical.
Yeah, exactly. Which is actually one of the things I've got to say that it shouldn't have. If anybody asked me and I thought about it for 30 seconds, I'd say, yeah, of course this will happen. But I have to admit, it did surprise me a little bit that I'd sort of forgotten how many totally unreconstructed late Hitchens fanboys were still walking around to like think that like Christopher Hitchens was right about everything in 2009.
You expected to be canceled from the far left for daring to try to revive Hitchens.
Right. Yeah, and whereas, like, yeah, by far the most vociferous criticism has been the opposite direction, that like I'm speaking too ill of the man. But I think so. And, you know, he pointed out that on this point, you know, Hitchens said things that are, you know, that are not like this, although I don't think that meant he didn't say the things I'm objecting to. I think that just meant there's some tensions within his views and practice, which is not, you know, uncommon. But I think that Hitchens tended to read the political valence of religion and irreligion in an oversimplified way, right? That he had that, in other words, I think he underestimated the potential of this kind of set of cultural symbolism to be, you know, appropriated in all sorts of different directions, you know, some of which we don't like and some of which we do like, which I think is just clearly, I mean, it clearly is capacious enough that can happen, right? There's plenty of evidence for that. And related to that, right, I think he probably thought that, you know, making people irreligious was going to be, you know, better for their politics than I think we know, you know, that it's necessarily, you know, going to be, right? You know, that, in other words, I think there's a certain conception of atheism as like a movement that doesn't make sense to me politically, in a way that I think at least sort of echoes what we've been saying about the history.
When did the new atheists come on the scene?
So it was in like, I think that it really started to blow up in like kind of midway through the second term of George W. Bush. And I think that and I've spent some time thinking about this. I think part of the reason that new atheism was a thing then, in a way, is that it really hasn't been since then. There's still a sort of shadow form that exists, but like it doesn't have the hold on the cultural imagination that it did in like, 2009 or whatever, when all the, four horsemen, Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris, were superstars for their anti-religious stuff, when like Family Guy would do jokes where like Brian meets one of his girlfriends because they're both reaching for Dawkins as the God delusion at the same time at the bookstore. Or like, whatever. All of these are just like old man references, but like the,
God, it's hard for me to believe, as an actual close to old man, that 2009 is now an old man reference. But go on.
Yeah, well, I keep interacting with people who don't remember any of this. It always makes me sad, but not because I think any of the stuff I mentioned particularly deserves to be remembered, but just because like it just messes with my sense of chronology. But but like I was just, like 6 Feet Under, like if you remember, like some of the religion stuff in there. So I think that the reason it made sense then, and I do think that a lot of the left slightly misremembers this history. Not completely, right? It's like Thales, but partially misremembers it, because I think that because a lot of people who were like new atheism fans in the late 2000s, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but because a recognizable chunk of them have gone in like super duper reactionary directions since then, or at the very least, like, very unpleasantly IDW-ish directions. I think a lot of people sort of read it with hindsight and read that into that cultural moment in the late 2000s. And I think they really overestimate the extent to which new atheism was about Islamophobia.
I was just going to raise, this is what I was about to raise. I mean, you're getting to what I was about to raise, which is, it seems to me that it came up, that the new atheist movement was born out of 9/11, out of a fear of the war of the Islamic war on the West.
I think that was part of it. I think that I think Islamophobia was definitely in the mix, but I think that what a lot of people really miss when they look back on it was the extent to which, in the culture wars as they existed in the late 2000s, like what new atheism was like the militant vanguard of Team Blue in the culture wars. That was the point. And I certainly think that part of how people got into this mindset where this seemed like quite so much of a burning issue to them is for sure 9/11 and the fact that Al-Qaeda style religious extremist terrorism was like much more on people's minds then than it is now, right? It took up way more space in their heads. And that's definitely part of it. But another part of it is that there was, that like George W. Bush was president and liberal America was like really scared of the evangelicals. That right. And that was a huge part of it. And like
but the nice thing with new atheism was it gave centrist liberal Democrats a way to be for the invasion of Iraq without having to jump in bed with the crazy white right-wing Christians that were supporting George W. Bush, right?
I think it certainly did serve that purpose for some people. I mean, I think in some ways it served that purpose for Christopher Hitchens, like even though like I sort of provide the receipts in my book, there's nothing that he was saying in the late 2000s that he hadn't been saying his whole life. He just hadn't emphasized it. Right. In the late 2000s, he started emphasizing it. And I think it's entirely psychologically plausible that like that's part of why, because he was in bed with these people on foreign policy, and he probably felt more comfortable with his role in the world if he was spending a lot of time fighting with them, and so if you can like transfer that to heaven, I mean, if they're agreeing too much on earth, although which is not to say there weren't tremendous disagreements on domestic social policy. And it's not even to say in Hitchens' particular case. I think his foreign policy views were like a weird, messy combination of stuff that you would think, given what he thought about Iraq, and stuff that didn't fit with that at all, because he was definitely evolving, at the time that he died. But I think, so I think that, I think Islamophobia is definitely part of it. But I also think that we underestimate, when we're looking back on it, how many people were fans of New Atheism who were horrified by the Iraq War. I think, my guess, I don't have any polling data about this, I could be wrong, I could be too influenced by like my memories anecdotally of my friend group or whatever, but my suspicion is that probably the majority of people who liked what Hitchens said about religion did not like what he said about Iraq. That they might have supported the war in Afghanistan, maybe even, right? but probably not Iraq. In fact, none of the other four horsemen were even quite with him on that, although some came close. Like I think Harris was sort of weaselly and and unclear in his position on Iraq, and had some terrible super reactionary general war.
Sam Harris wanted to avoid the war by torturing all the Muslims.
Exactly.
Okay,
I was just going to say though, like I also think like the fact that in the 2000s there were still these battles going on about like intelligent design in the schools, which in retrospect, that was like a sort of, this was like the last stand of that stuff, like rather, but like, I think a lot of liberal America perceived it as like they were under siege from this, rather than that they were like fighting like mop up operations, for a war that they basically won. Gay marriage was a big issue. I mean, I think that the way that right now, the typical sort of militant liberals' anxiety about the right is that they're racist and fascists. And I'm not saying that wasn't part of the mix of anxieties about the right liberal America had in the late 2000s, but I think that person would probably be more like they're crazy theocrats and who want to ban abortion and put gay people in the closet, and in many cases that was even linked to like the fact that like Bush was starting this crazy war and all that stuff. I mean, it was all sort of part of one big perception of what was going on. And I think New Atheism stopped making like, and even back then, right? I mean, I liked a lot of the things that I still like a lot of the things that Hitchens said in those religion debates, but I think that I do have the social media proof that, if you look at my old Facebook posts, that like atheism as like a sort of quasi-political movement never made sense to me in the late 2000s. I mean, I was too much of an old school socialist for that, but I think in a general cultural way, I think it felt like it makes sense because of where the culture wars were there at the time. Whereas I think by not that many years after Hitchens had died, the culture war had shifted so much that like it just didn't make like people who were sort of on the same team in the religion culture wars were not necessarily going to be on the same team anymore. And it just like people got mad about different issues and they drifted in different directions. And so, yeah, I think you have like Sam Harris obviously became an IDW guy. Daniel Dennett, as far as I could tell, just came back to just like sort of went back to being a quiet philosophy nerd. Richard Dawkins, I guess, is probably the one who's still saying the stuff that's, closest to his old areas of emphasis, but he's also just this kind of like strange old man on Twitter. And, and Hitchens is dead. But I also think like a big chunk of the ground troops of New Atheism for the late 2000s have actually just become, whatever, like at least like sort of decent social democratic leftists, in the time since then. Again, at least anecdotally, I see a whole lot of that, that and in fact, many people who went through all of that now have sort of strange mixed feelings about that, or aren't completely sure what they think about it, looking back on it. But I think it was just going to go in a lot of different directions because it didn't make sense for everybody to kind of stay together in that mold. And I guess the last thing I would say is just, one thing that I was doing, part of why I was interested in writing this book in the first place is that I've always found the religion and atheism stuff a fascinating subject. And I wanted to like work out some of what I thought about it. And I think that 99% of what I said in the book, I still think now, but I think that even in the like year or whatever, you know, since I wrote it, like I have kept thinking about it, and my feelings are maybe very slightly more mixed now in just this way, which is that I still think, look, who do I see as more of an ally? You know, Cornel West or, you know, other progressive Christians, you know, my wife, right? You know, people like that, you know, or like some like atheist libertarian who, you know,
the amazing atheist.
Yeah. I mean, clearly the former, right? And I want people to be clear on that. I think the idea that it's like this huge political imperative to like get everybody to agree with you about like metaphysics still doesn't make sense to me. But I will say, I think that my long-standing view, and the one that is still kind of reflected in the book, was that I would say all that stuff that I just said, but then I would say, look, I'm, you know, at bottom, right? I mean, like, beyond anything else, I'm a huge philosophy nerd, so like obviously I enjoy arguing about this stuff. I just want to, you know, I just want to be very clear that nobody, you know, like thinks that I see that as like integrated into a political project in a way that I don't, which is, you know, I mean, I've at this point, you know, whatever, I've done like a couple debates about it, or like in the Charlie Kirk debate, there was like a little chunk where we started talking about that. And like, I always start with qualifications like I just did. And I probably always will, because I think that's like a politically useful thing to do. But I guess I do think that beyond just the fact that arguing about philosophy is fun, that there is some legitimate role to be played. Like there is some like functional utility to doing some sort of public atheism. And the way that I've increasingly see that is just this, not that, you know, you should like make people atheists because then they'll agree with you about politics, but that, look, this might be old hat to us, but they're making new human beings all the time, you know, that they're you know, new ones are dropping every day. And it's still going to be interesting to them, right? I mean, like, especially people who grow up in religious backgrounds and start to have their doubts about that stuff, and might, I think having somebody sort of articulating their thoughts and kind of reassuring them that like they're right to have these doubts, and you know, especially like, you know, people in those circumstances might start, you know, like if they've been taught their entire life that, you know, religion is inextricably linked to morality, right? If I have trouble taking the metaphysics seriously now, does that mean I'm a bad person? You know, I think there are useful roles that can be played by a certain kind of public atheism. I just think that like a better version would be one that, you know, steered people clear of the idea that, you know, they should sort of see allies and enemies in the larger world primarily on the basis of like who thinks what about metaphysics, right? I mean, I think there's got to be a way, I hope there's a way to do public atheism that encourages people, you know, like sort of emphasizes the like, you know, intellectual rigor and like discourages people from being weird assholes about it.
Well, it sounds like you have a very complicated set of justifications for it still being invested in the New Atheist project and Christopher Hitchens. And I agree with most of what you said. And, you know, I certainly would agree that, you know, creating the space for people to be atheists, and, you know, having those books out there is a good thing. And people should read Hitchens, and probably even Sam Harris. Okay. But at least some of what he wrote. But I wanted to get back, and we're running out of time. So, but I wanted to ask you about being on Rogan a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Okay. And also about your book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, which is the actual title, not I Hate the Left and Fuck You All, or whatever I said it was at the beginning of this. But from what I saw, I mean, I did not watch all 3 hours or 2 hours and 58 minutes or whatever it was of the Rogan interview.
You're exaggerating. It's 2 hours and 48 minutes.
Okay. All right. It was 2 hours and 48 minutes. I did not watch it all, but I did skim through it. I watched bits of it, you know, and I like flipped around through it.
Yeah.
And it did not seem to me that, despite the fact that you and Rogan got along, and that you didn't have any major visible disagreements, that it did not seem to me that Rogan really took up your perspective or your arguments about why the cancellations of comedians was going on, or what it was symptomatic of, or it seemed like there was a fundamental difference of opinion between you and Rogan. And Rogan seemed to me to think that, a large part of what's going on is people are being shitty. And that a lot of people who are on the left and just enjoy being kind of assholes, and they're virtue signaling for the sake of virtue signaling, and that they're not about anything else. And, I think a certain perspective, I mean, he's very gentle guy, actually really likable guy, but I think certain sort of simplistic anti-woke perspective is there with Rogan, especially now, maybe. And your attempts to make him see this as a product of political impotence and a product of a left that is struggling to find a purchase that seems necessary right now, seemed to me to be not entirely wasted, but sort of missed. Like you didn't even hear it or something.
Well, look, I mean, I think that this is stuff that he has been thinking about for a very long time, right? Like this is, I mean, like we just came out of, or I don't know, whatever, maybe we're still in it, I'm not quite sure, but like we had like a month of Rogan Discourse which is like amazing, by the way, because like this is like something that like if you had written it in like a science fiction short story, it would have just seemed like heavy-handed to make it this extreme, right? That like we had weeks where the news cycle was primarily about Joe Rogan, even though the United States and Russia were closer to the brink of war than they've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we're on the brink of, and now we're having the largest war in Europe since World War II. So he's been, he has been at the center of a lot of sort of culture war firestorms, and has been for a long time. I mean, in the book, I talk about like a controversy about Rogan that was, whatever that was like 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. So it's not exactly new ground for him. And I wouldn't necessarily expect, I mean, obviously it would be nice if every time I gave somebody my analysis, they were like, aha, right? Now I get it, right? Like I understand everything clearly now because you've given me the right, analytical tools to get that. I mean, a lot of times, unfortunately, people just be like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know, but like, here's what I think, right? Which I think unfortunately might be more realistic. I think it's useful to say that stuff because not necessarily because he's going to be like immediately on board first conversation, that like he'll see things the way that I do. Although I actually do not think it's impossible that there could be, future conversations, and, who knows? I mean, I think that whatever criticisms you have of Joe Rogan, like I think being like ideologically inflexible, right? Is
certainly not one of them. No, but what do you think explains the Joe Rogan month that we just had? Why did the left want to focus on Rogan for that long? Or was it the left? Was it just the mainstream?
So it was the left to an extent, and I'm going to be like, I think the stupidest way to have this conversation would be to make it about personality. So I'm going to try to avoid doing that, but like, I do think that there's a general phenomenon that happens here that is linked to what I say in the book, and like some of what I said about the book in my conversation with him, which is that there's so little of a left, right? Like it's not, I mean, there is a sense in which the left, at the risk of sounding like people that I've sometimes been irritated by in the past, right? There's a sense
you're thinking of. The left is dead. The left is dead. Long live the left.
There's a sense in which it almost doesn't exist, right? Like that there's by historical standards, and you don't have to go back to like 1918 or whatever, like you could just say like by the standards of like certainly like Britain in like Britain in the 80s, say, right? Like that's a time and place where nobody was on the brink of a socialist revolution or anything, right? There was certainly no mass, crazy radical level of consciousness, but there was, I think, a well-defined, very real left in a way that even in Britain now there probably isn't, and there for damn sure isn't right now in the United States, which is to say that there was something that was organically connected with a significant organized chunk of the working class and its concerns that understood itself in terms of, socialist, certainly at least sensibilities, and so, and if you think about, even though, again, it was like Britain in the 80s is a time when the left is like super duper on the defensive, right? It's losing battle after battle, but like it just clearly exists in a way that I think it sort of does now, that we have DSA, which again, I encourage people to join. I think it's not perfect, but I think it has value. But that's even now, right? I mean, like it's unfathomably larger than it was, but I mean, I'm pretty sure, it would not be a large city, right? If it were, if DSA were a city.
I think it's been shrinking lately too, Ben. The DSA membership has been shrinking. Okay. So
here's what I was going to say about it, right? Like, so is just that the point is, because what we mostly have now, what we're not entirely, not without exception, but we're mostly talking about, we talk about the left in the United States right now, is some journalists, some academics, 100 million or so podcasters, and I don't know, some publishers, like that all of these, we're talking about a relatively small portion of the population, and a very small portion of the population overall, even if it's way bigger than it was in the recent past. And we're also talking about something that's largely disconnected from mainstream working class organization. So I think what that ends up meaning in practice is that, because the left often just doesn't feel like an independent player in day-to-day politics, like in some ways, part of why I think the Bernie moment was so exciting was that in some, however rudimentary and social democratic way, that it started to feel like there was this separate, left identified player. But that's, I mean, even that opening, right, is like things have changed a lot, not in a good way. And so I think that because the left doesn't feel like an independent player, I think a lot of people on the left just end up getting sucked in practice to just like doing what everybody else does, which is like cheer for whatever their team is, and the red versus blue culture wars. And, sure, like leftists put a leftist spin on it, but I mean, that's still basically what they're doing. And that's not always bad. I mean, if what we're arguing about is like, should trans people have rights, that it's good to, to side with Team Blue on that, right? But like, what thing it does mean, though, is that people end up approaching politics primarily from a perspective not of like, look, I have socialist values, I have a materialist analysis of the world around me, and I'm going to go forward from those starting points. But instead from, here are the people that I most hate, I really need to own them, and I'm going to work backwards from that. And I think there's a tremendous amount of that in like, the online left, which, if we're going to be honest about it, right, the distinction between the online left and just the left, right, is not as sharp as we might like to believe, right?
Right.
So so I think that people end up getting sucked into like just whatever the liberal narrative is in the culture wars this week, whether it really quite makes sense if you were starting, from your politics and working forward rather than the other way around. So does Joe Rogan being wrong about aspects of COVID, which I certainly think have said that he is like that. So you say, oh, aha, see, therefore this, like, people getting mad at Rogan, or like maybe wanting Spotify to kick Rogan off even, or whatever, like that's that's going to help. This is a life or death issue because that's gonna stop the spread of, do something significant to stop the spread of COVID.
Yeah.
Which I think we could get into like the empirical nitty gritty. I'm not persuaded by that actual matter, but like also like whether that's true or not, right?
Why is that the left's job?
Exactly, right? Right, why is that the thing that like we're focused on? Is that right?
Last I remember, I'm not getting a paycheck from Dr. Fauci or the World Health Organization. I mean, my job is not to mitigate the COVID crisis as a member of the left. Like, sure. I mean, I don't want to make it worse.
Yeah, right. I mean, somebody should be mitigating the COVID crisis, but I mean, that's not really the mission statement of the left as a political force, right?
Right. Yeah.
I want to. I mean, I think after I disagree with 99% of what happened after 9/11, but was preventing further terrorist attacks with police work and etc. something someone somewhere should do? Yeah. Right, like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
exactly. Was it what the left should have focused on? Certainly not.
We could have included in that particular case. We could have said, look, going to war in Iraq is going to make our chances of being attacked by terrorists greater, rather than I would say that kind of thing.
Make those arguments, but yeah,
I did. But okay, here's the thing I wanted to get at with Rogan and all of this is that I think, as a content producer, as an online leftist, I have not talked about Rogan since I moved over to the new channel. This will be the first time Rogan's come up.
Yep.
But I also didn't talk about what was going on in Ukraine. I mean, I have a podcast on that now. It will be coming out soon that I've recorded already. But what I was doing was sort of trying to reassess after the failure that's still 2 years out, still reassessing what happened after the Bernie campaign and thinking about the history of socialism and frankly, just dealing with the calamity that hit my own career and channel. But it seems like one of the problems I had with doing anything about Rogan was that I didn't have a choice as to how I could approach it. I had to either say, yay Rogan or nay Rogan, right? Ultimately. And if I given that choice, I would have to have said yay Rogan.
Sure.
But
that's not what you want to spend your time doing.
Right, exactly.
No, I think that's totally fair. But this is something I struggle with all the time. I mean, not like,
if I'd known it would get me on Rogan's show, I would have said yay Rogan for months. But
trust me when I said that was the interventions that I have made on the Rogan issue, that was never a thought that entered my head, right? I think that not that it would have been illegitimate if it had, it just didn't, right?
But did did that play into why you got invited on? Do you think?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think that it's actually. Sorry, I was just pausing for a second to think if I should say this in public. I think it's fine, right? That so there's somebody. I know for a fact at this point that there's somebody who works for him who is interested in things that are somewhat adjacent to what we do, who's like a fan of like Mark Fisher and stuff like that. But and it's not out of the question that guy could have said something about my book. I think there are actually like a few different possible pathways to how this could have happened. I don't know. I mean, I have all I know is I mean, it's like Dave Smith, somebody who obviously I really disagree with. He's a libertarian, but like I've you
debated him.
Yeah,
you have a relationship with him.
Yeah, I've debated him, but I also have a good relationship with him. Right? He's like my fourth most problematic friend or something like that. But
where am I on that list, by the way?
Okay, you're at least like the 8th or 9th most problematic friend of mine. But
God damn it, I got to get higher up on the list.
But I think. But I mean, come on. Like, I know Thaddeus Russell. I mean,
I know. Too many problematic people ahead of me.
But I was just gonna say, right? Like, so it's possible. I did write this article for the Daily Beast about the online censorship issue that's coming up around Rogan. It's possible that was part of it. It's possible that he saw me on Crystal and Kyle. I have no idea. Like the initial message that I got from somebody who worked for him was just like, hey, how would you feel about coming on the Joe Rogan Experience to talk about your book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, and whatever else is true about like how like I pinged on the radar in the first place. I mean, I'm sure the title of that book is the main reason that I was ultimately invited, right? But I was just gonna, because obviously, if there's one person that title would speak to in the world, right, it's got to be him. But
right.
But I mean, I wasn't. I mean, it's funny because, like, I know, of course, our late friend Michael.
I was going to ask you. This is what I want to ask you about. Is what were you surprised to know that Rogan knew Michael Brooks and had followed his career and had opinions about Michael Brooks? Because that's something that came up in the interview.
Yeah, I was a little, right? Like I know, like there was just a little bit of prior evidence that like he sort of vaguely knew who that was. That he'd like mentioned him on air like in passing once, but like he also got his name wrong. That I think he called him Michael Roberts. But and then he like tweeted to apologize for that, right? But that's the only previous sign that like he had any idea who that was. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by that because like part of what, again, unlike Michael, right, who is somebody who did not suffer from like doubts about whether things that he would want to happen would happen, right? They like it never even occurred to me as a possibility that I'd be invited on Rogan like that. That would have just seemed ridiculous to me. And I know you even like brought it up once in like a meeting about the book. I was like, yeah, okay, make that happen, go for it, But like, but
I did about canceling comedians, particularly, right?
Yeah. You did bring it up at one point, and of course I wasn't going to be like no, but I also did take it seriously. And
we did send him an email, I think, at one point.
Oh, so maybe it was like maybe like a year later or whatever. They somebody.
I'm going to take credit for it. We got you on Rogan. That's
nice.
And the people who work at Zero Books now, they didn't do shit for you, but I got you on Rogan. Just you remember that.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. So I think, but yeah, I mean, I didn't think it was going to happen. I mean, when I got that initial message, my first reaction was to Google the rogue JRE employee who'd sent me the message because my first thought was it was an elaborate prank. And then once I'd done that and I was convinced it was real, I like took my laptop over to my wife and she said I looked so shocked she was going to ask who died. Like that just seemed unreal to me. But one thing that did make it a little bittersweet is that I know Michael really wanted to go on. Like he'd said so privately and publicly, many times. And I also know, like, I think I did okay. I think he would have killed it. Like
he would have just done great. Yeah. I mean,
how good.
I hate, and look, I don't want to like knock you here, but watching it, I did think to myself, Michael would just be
of course
chewing this place up. He would just be, he would have been, Michael would have gone on Joe Rogan and he would have become a regular on Joe Rogan and he would have blown up,
Yeah. No, I don't have the slightest doubt about that. I mean, I think that because I think it's an environment that like, I could do okay in. I mean, like for like for being like a leftist intellectual weirdo, like I'm probably on the broy end of the leftist intellectual weirdo spectrum, but I, and I think there are a variety of things.
Michael Brooks had trained his whole career to leapfrog off of Joe Rogan to greater fame than Joe Rogan could ever know.
Yeah.
That's what I'll say.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like I had, so because that had been in my mind a lot, the like week and a half or whatever between the invitation actually going on, I had, I was very pleasantly surprised by that. Like, I did not think that he was as much on his radar as he turned out to be. And it wasn't just like, okay, we're talking about your dead friend, so I'm gonna like say something nice just to just to like be a nice guy or whatever. Like but I don't really know who that is. Like there was like a good minute of him talking about Michael that made it clear that he'd watched enough of his work to really know what he was talking about.
I don't know if he even knew you were his friend when you brought it up. You brought Michael Brooks' name up, I think, but he knew who he was. It was clear. He thought he was funny. He thought he was good as far as like. As a social critic and a critic of the right. And it did make me sad too, that it was not that it was you up there, but that it wasn't going to lead to Michael being up there next. Yeah,
exactly. Yep.
Listen, we've been talking for an hour, 15 minutes. I feel like this is long enough. I'll release just this as a podcast. This will be the Joe Rogan debrief. with a subtitle, why we should all be Hitchens style atheists or something like that. But you should come back on now that you've been on Rogan. There's a very good chance that you're going to, I don't know, get a movie deal, or you're going to write a book like 15 Rules for Dweebs or something. And you'll be the biggest thing since sliced bread. Barry Weiss is going to adopt you as a child. Who knows what will happen next?
So, well, that'd be an interesting twist. Could, I think.
So what I'm saying is, don't forget me. Like,
sure. No,
you got to come back.
I will endeavor to always keep you at least as much in my thoughts as my new McCarthyite mother, Barry Weiss.
Oh, great. Well, thanks a lot. All right.